Hey guys, today I'm going to be building a little room box display area so that when I do miniature foods and stuff like that, I have somewhere to put them and take pictures of them without having to build a new room every single time. This is going to be in 24th scale because that's the scale that I usually work in when I'm doing a little room or anything. I've gone much smaller than that on other projects, but for the most part, when it's a room scene, it's in that scale. And also, I feel like most of the room boxes that you see online are in 1/12 scale, so I'm going to show you more of a step-by-step this week on how to make something like this, starting completely from scratch from building the pattern and all the way through to making the actual room box itself. Let's get started. The first thing I'm working on is a pattern for the room. Right now, I'm doing the back wall of this room box. I decided to make it 9 feet tall. And since this is going to be in a scale where 1/2 of an inch equals 1 foot of real world space, it's going to be 4.5 inches long. The length of the room is going to be 14 feet, so that's going to be 7 inches long. And then I'm going to go in and draw the other 2 corners of this wall. Using this grid helps me to make sure that my lines are as straight as they can be when I'm doing this by hand, but I'm also using this L-shaped ruler to help with that. For the back wall, I want there to be 3 windows. I looked around my own little apartment to see what size the windows here were and used that for a little bit of a guide to try and get an idea of how many feet a normal window should be, and that's what I'm using for these measurements. So for the windows, I decided to make them 2.5 feet by 4 feet. Then I converted that to inches to use for making this pattern based on the scale that I'm using, which again was the 1/2 inch equals a foot or 1/24 scale. I have a video that explains how to work with scale, and I'll link that here either on screen or down in the description box if you want a really good breakdown of how to calculate scale for your own builds. This video is walking you through step-by-step of my process of how I build these things, but if you'd like a build-along video where we make something simple and you guys have a finished product with me at the end of it, then drop that down in the comments. Okay guys, so we've gotten to a point where we have the basic layout of the back wall with everything in scale. And here's where I want to talk to you guys, because once we start going smaller than our grid boxes, sometimes the math can be a little bit annoying because you won't have an exact tick mark for the number. You won't have an exact tick mark on your ruler for the number you come up with if you do it straight by the math. So oftentimes at this point, I'll start to try and get things as close as possible to what they would be if they were perfectly in scale. But I don't let the exact number start to throw me off from just like getting what I want out of my build. If you like to be more exact, get used to working with millimeters. You can be a lot more precise with millimeters, but we're over here in the US, so inches is just the way we're gonna go most of the time. So I chose a measurement for the width of the window frames that was pretty much arbitrary. I just did it based on appearance and how I thought it should look. And then I switched over to using millimeters so that I could get the exact number to go around the edges of all of the windows and adding those in. Now I'm drawing in the actual window frame that's going to be inside the window and go around the pane of glass. And now you have to start thinking about the materials that you're going to use to build the thing in the end, because you have to start considering the thickness of the material itself. So let me grab some materials and show you what I'm talking about. So here I have 2 different paperboards. This paperboard is about 1/8 of an inch thick. That is a big difference from this paperboard, which is, so this paperboard is less than a 1/16 of an inch thick. If I was building this building out of paper,
The paper's thickness would be microscopic. The paper is maybe like 1/10 of a millimeter thick. It pretty much is as thin as the lines that I have on here. So if I was for some reason building this whole thing out of paper, I wouldn't probably even have to consider the thickness of the material at all. So that means we have to take a little bit of time to think about how we want to construct the thing while we're still planning it. Like, for instance, I want these windows to be cut out of the main material that I use for the back of this wall. And then I want to build each window, slot it into there, and glue it in place. And ultimately, I want to have the windows be able to open and close. But because I want this window to be a slot out that goes into the wall, I need to think about how thick the wall is going to be. I need to think about these windows when they're going past each other. It's going to be double the thickness. So if I'm making this out of this like wider cardboard, then I need to double the amount of space of depth that this window is going to have. That's something you kind of figure out by building. As you're building and using the materials, you get used to that more, and then you can sort of figure that out a lot easier. But in the beginning, you might need to measure the material you're using, because even the paperboard that I'm using is much thinner than if I was using like corrugated cardboard or something for this. A lot of packaging, if you look around your cupboards or when you go shopping, you'll notice is made out of paperboard. So you can cut these into rectangles and just keep an assortment of them in like a drawer that you use for crafting. Most of them are pretty thin. They're about the same thickness as this first thin one I showed you. You can do things like bend it if you're making arches or circles or curves or anything like that. And then if you need thicker paperboard like this, back of these art pads or notebooks, they'll have this thicker paperboard, and then you can also cut this and like glue it together to make it even thicker if you need it to be thicker. Another even more accessible and cheaper option for building these is to use foam board. And foam board usually comes in 1/4 of an inch thick sheets, like paper-backed sheets. It's also pretty good because it's inexpensive and it stays pretty rigid for you to make your models out of.
I went ahead and used some tracing paper to trace over the wall details and the windows, and then just made it only the length of the side walls. I did that for both sides of the room box, so I didn't have to start from scratch. And then I used the length of the side and the length of the back wall to create the floor. Now that I have all of my different pieces ready, the back wall, the floor, and the two sides of the box, I'm not going to do a roof or a front, so I went ahead and traced all of those onto some tracing paper to get rid of the grid lines, and then I'm going to scan these into the computer. Right when I figured I was done with everything, I realized I did want to add a door to one of the sides, so I went back in and did a door. And I made the door the same height as the windows with the little edging around it. And the door is, the actual door itself is 3 feet, which is 1.5 inches wide. Yeah, last minute I decided I wanted to add that, and I still did everything exactly the same way that I did the other parts, but I just randomly added a door there. The next step in the process is to take those tracings that I did and scan them into the computer. I'm gonna tape this one down to a piece of white printer paper, and that's just gonna make sure that it's not crooked when I scan it, and that I have the edges of the printer paper to make sure it stays in scale, because sometimes my my computer just like scans it at a weird size. Once it's in the computer, I use Photoshop to darken the lines, and sometimes I clean it up or go over the lines, but then I can fix anything if I made some mistakes. Like here I added on gray rectangles to the edges where I needed to glue things together. Ideally, I should have done that when I was planning it out and drawn it all before, so I wouldn't have to correct anything, and I could just use those transparent sheets. So you do not need a computer, but I make a lot of mistakes and it's easier for me to catch it on the computer. And that way I can print out multiple copies. I'm spraying it down to some foam board using some spray adhesive and then cutting out the pieces. I'm using some foam glue to attach some strips of paper to all of the raw edges of foam so that they can be covered up. I'm using cardstock paper for the molding around the floor and around the ceiling, and I used 2 strips of paper and cut one a little bit shorter than the other so that it would have this molding detail. Now I'm going over the entire wall with acrylic paint. I'm painting over all of those lines and everything because they're not really necessary any longer, and they're not really going to be visible because they're going to be covered up with the window frames and things like that. But even if they were visible, now would be the time when I would just paint over them and they'd disappear. I'm painting over the window frames right now and the little insert that's going to hold the frames so they don't fall out of the windows. And I'm doing the painting and letting them dry first because I don't want to glue anything in place without it being painted, since it'll be hard to then go in and paint it afterwards, especially after it's glued down to like the window pane. But I want this room box to look nice on the inside and on the outside and the walls around the outside. So that's another reason why I want this to be painted before I start gluing anything together. I'm only going to have one window be openable, so with that one I did 2 of the little frames that are surrounding the window panes to keep them from falling out. I did one for the back and one for the front. The rest of them didn't need it because the windows are just going to be glued shut. Now I'm going in and adding the window frames. And I created the door by taking 2 pieces of thicker paperboard and gluing them together, and on the thin piece of paperboard on the top I cut out an internal rectangle a little bit smaller so that it would have this panel design on it. Now I'm just going to paint this door with some white acrylic paint, my go-to paint for painting almost anything that I make. And I just started painting it when I remembered that I need to attach the hinges to the door. When I first decided to make this door and these hinges, I wanted working hinges so that the door could open and close. And I made them out of some metal foil that's not as thin as tin foil, but it also wasn't really sturdy enough and the hinges broke. So the door isn't really able to be opened and closed. So I just glued it in place, but here's me attaching the hinges anyway. I made a doorknob for the inside of the door using a basswood dowel, and I just carved it by hand. If I needed more of these, I could potentially go in and use the silicone mold to make a bunch of them, but since I'm only doing one door and I'm not even going to put it on the outside, I just used the wooden one that I had carved. I attached the door hinges to the door frame using super glue, and that was okay to use with this because it's not going directly onto the foam since I have that paper lining on the inside. And here's an example of the door opening and closing. It did work in the beginning, and I feel like making the hinges this way would still work as long as I use a better metal in the future that's not as thin as this foil. For the floorboards, I'm using one giant piece of basswood, but I made 4 panels out of it and then switched them around so that the wood grain wouldn't be consistent throughout the entire floor and kind of give away that it was one solid piece, because this is supposed to be many different floorboards laid down. I carved some lines into the wood for the edges of the floorboards, and then I went over those lines with a soldering iron just to darken them up. And then I sanded down the floorboards. Next, I stained the floors using a mixture of acrylic paint and a product called Make It Stain that makes normal acrylic paint into wood stain. I'll have that linked down in the supply list in the description box. Now it's time to glue the back wall down, and I did that using some foam glue. I mixed together a paste for the outside of the building to simulate some stucco, and I used some acrylic paint, a little bit of drywall, some white glue, and then I threw in just a pinch of sawdust because I wanted a little bit more texture. And that was it. This is the finished room box. This is going to come in handy for all of my photography needs when I need to take pictures of tiny things in a room without having to build a room from scratch each time. Next week, we're going to be back in building fantasy dioramas because I took a little break from that while I was sick, but I still have a really big project that's coming up that I want to show you guys, and I'm super excited for. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and learned some things. Let me know what you thought. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.